Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and we'll be looking at another discourse from the Buddha today. So this is from the Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutta number 41. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then I'll talk about the discourse. So read through the discourse and give some explanations. And then if there's any questions, I'll answer those at the end. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So, as mentioned, this is Anguttara Nikaya, chapter 5, sutta number 41, the Ādiyasutta, which is, I'm reading here from Bhante Suddhāso's translation, and he entitled this Getting Rich. So, not the most common topic to talk about when normally we're focused on renunciation, so it's interesting to see what the Buddha has to say on the topic. So the discourse begins, the Buddha says, at one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi and Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. Then the householder Anathapindika went to the Buddha, bowed and sat down to one side. For those who don't know, Anathapindika was one of the major lay supporters of the Buddhist monastic community at the time. He was a very wealthy businessman in Savatthi. And he was famous for, among other things, he was famous for donating a large chunk of forest land just outside Savatthi, which was called Anathapindikasa Arama, so the forest monastery of Anathapindika. This is the place where the largest number of suttas are recorded as having been given at. So Anathapindika then bears a special place in the heart of Buddhists as being the one who donated the forest monastery where the Buddha seems to have done most of his teaching and probably spent most of his time. And again, Anathapindika was a very famous and well-known lay person. So the Buddha said to him, householder, there are these 5 reasons to get rich, or to accumulate wealth, or to get wealth. And what 5? He says, first, with one's legitimate wealth. So legitimate wealth in Pali is Dhamma Ladda. So that means what you've acquired in accordance with Dhamma. So that means you didn't steal it or get it deceitfully or acquire it through evil or unwholesome occupations, but rather you acquire your wealth in a wholesome way, in a morally appropriate way, in a way that doesn't involve breaking the 5 precepts or causing harm to anyone. So he says, with one's legitimate wealth, earned by one's effort and initiative, built up with one's own hands, gathered by the sweat of the brow, a disciple of the noble ones makes oneself happy and pleased, keeping oneself properly happy. One makes one's mother and father happy, one's children, partners, servants, workers, and staff and happy, and as above, happy and pleased, keeping them properly satisfied. So the Buddha says this is the first reason to get rich. So here it's talking about the most basic reason why one might work to accumulate wealth. It's first off to keep yourself taken care of. So making sure your own needs are provided for, making sure that you yourself are living a comfortable life. And then your immediate family, so especially your parents, taking care of your parents, making sure that your parents have everything that they need, that they're living comfortably, and then the rest of your immediate family, so your children, your spouse, and then also anybody who is dependent upon you. So your employees, your servants, anybody who relies upon you for their well-being. So again, pointing out here that it starts, of course, with taking care of your own needs, but then to provide for everyone within your immediate sphere. So your parents, your children, your spouse, and your employees. You should be making sure that you're using your wealth to keep all these people happy and comfortable and well taken care of. So this is a legitimate reason to accumulate wealth. So notice here that there is both the aspect of taking care of yourself and also taking care of your loved ones and your dependents in particular. Then the second one. So the Buddha says, further, with one's legitimate wealth, one makes one's friends and colleagues happy and pleased, keeping them properly happy. So this is taking it one step farther. So not just making yourself comfortable, not just making your immediate family and your dependents happy and comfortable, but also doing what you can to support and offer and give things to your friends and colleagues. So a bit of a wider circle here. So noticing again that the emphasis here about getting wealth is to share it with others. That of course it starts with making sure that you yourself are looked after. But then the next concern is always, what can we do for the benefit of others? So accumulating wealth for the sake of supporting other people and doing good things for other people. Then the third one, the Buddha says, furthermore, with one's legitimate wealth, one protects oneself against losses from such things as fire, water, kings, bandits, or unloved heirs. So one keeps oneself safe from these dangers. So this is the third reason to get rich. So here it's talking about, I actually really dislike the translation get rich. So boganang adya means acquisition of wealth, acquiring wealth. So what's the reason for acquiring wealth? It's for the sake of these things. I really think get rich is just not quite right. This is always the danger of reading from other people's translations. Anyway, so this one is talking about acquiring wealth in order to protect oneself from dangerous situations or from loss due to accidents or unforeseen problems. So the modern example of this would be insurance, though in the time of the Buddha, I don't know if insurance policies existed, but the idea of having a backup in case something disastrous happens, so you wouldn't be completely wiped out. So like the old saying, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Well, here a point in acquiring a bit of extra wealth is so that if something disastrous does happen, you have something in reserve. You have some backup that will keep you going so that you're not completely impoverished by one unlucky turn of events. Then the fourth one, he says, furthermore, with one's legitimate wealth, one makes 5 spirit offerings. The word spirit isn't in the text. Baling just means an offering. So one makes 5 offerings to relatives, guests, ancestors, the king, and deities. This is the fourth reason to acquire wealth. So again, it's emphasizing the aspect of generosity. So why does one acquire wealth? It's to make offerings, to give things to relatives, as prior mentioned, to guests. So this is something which comes up in many places in the suttas, but I've noticed doesn't actually get emphasized that often, which is in many places in the suttas, the Buddha praises the virtue of hospitality, the virtue of being hospitable to guests, of being welcoming and supportive to guests. So this is one case where that's mentioned, kind of buried in a list of other things, admittedly. So making offerings, being generous and supportive to guests. So this is something which, when I'm doing the monastic practice of wandering. It's actually quite remarkable how many people are perfectly happy to host a couple of random wandering monks for a night or 2 nights. I've had many occasions where particularly Catholic monks or Catholic nuns or Catholic organizations have been completely unbothered by the fact that we're practicing a different religion, and yet they're delighted at the opportunity to practice hospitality. So they would offer us a place to stay. They'd make sure that we had food and all the supplies that we need. So this delighting in hospitality, the opportunity to take care of guests. And offerings to one's ancestors. So this is a very common feature throughout the Asian cultural sphere. Historically, it was also an element in Western culture, but it's mostly faded away these days. But the idea of honoring and respecting one's departed ancestors as an important use of wealth. So to this day, many people from particularly traditional Eastern cultures will have shrines to their ancestors in their homes or memorials to their departed ancestors, cultivating that sense of respect and appreciation for those who have come before us. Offerings to the king. Again, in traditional cultures, there's often a sense of respect for those in government positions of power. Doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with everything that they're doing. In fact, it's pretty common to disagree with things that your government officials are doing. But nonetheless, we appreciate the fact that they are in a position of service. Whether we think they're using that position in the best way or not is beside the point. We still cultivate a sense of gratitude and appreciation for those who are taking responsibility for trying to steer the country in a good direction. And the fifth one is making offerings to deities, to spirits. The Pali word here is devata, so devata baling, offerings to the devas. Again, this is something which has been common throughout human cultures all over the world. So traditionally, one makes offerings to especially the local spirits. So whatever spirits or divine beings might be living in the area or might be watching over the area, we make offerings to show that we have respect for them, to show our appreciation and gratitude for their presence and for their efforts to watch over us and watch over the space where we live. So cultivating that sense of respect and appreciation towards the other beings that share our space. That's the fourth reason to acquire wealth. Then the fifth one, he says, furthermore, with one's legitimate wealth, one establishes an uplifting religious donation for contemplatives and Brahmins, those who refrain from intoxication and negligence, who are settled in patience and kindness, and who tame, calm, and awaken themselves. So one makes such a donation which is conducive to heaven, ripens in happiness, and leads to rebirth in heaven. This is the fifth reason to acquire wealth. So this again is another legitimate reason to try to accumulate wealth. Again, not just for one's own sake, but in order to support people who are living a dedicated spiritual life, to support the monks and priests in the world who have chosen to dedicate their life to spiritual practice, who have chosen to dedicate their life to religiosity, those who have chosen to commit themselves to the higher calling, the calling of living in a divine way, to living as close as possible to divinity in this life. So supporting and making offerings to those who are living a monastic life, a contemplative life, a spiritual religious life. This is something which is extremely important all throughout the suttas. The Buddha emphasizes the importance and value of supporting those who are living a committed spiritual life. And interestingly enough, the Buddha doesn't restrict this only to Buddhist monks. Also supporting contemplatives and monks and priests of other religious orders is also something which is praiseworthy and meritorious. Because what we're supporting is not necessarily those individuals, but rather we're supporting the ideal of commitment to a spiritual life. So of course that does involve supporting particular monastics, particular communities. But what it's indicating to our own mind is it's indicating our deep reverence and respect for a committed spiritual life and an understanding of the importance and value of dedicated spiritual practitioners living a completely committed spiritual life. So then the Buddha continues, he says, now if the wealth the disciple of the Noble One gets for these 5 reasons runs out, they think, well, the wealth I have obtained for these reasons is running out, and he has no regrets. So I find this delightful. So it's you put all this effort into acquiring money so that you can do all these good things, and then you start running out of money and you're like, well, I have no regrets. So it's reflecting, it's like, oh, I've done so much good. Like I didn't just use it to buy my 3rd private jet. I didn't just use it to get a bunch of frivolous or silly things. But rather I used it to support people. I used it to help others. I used it to cultivate my own spiritual practice. I used it to support the spiritual practice of others. It's like, oh, well, I've put my wealth to good use. I haven't been squandering or wasting it. I've been using it. I've been using it well. I've been using it for good things. The Buddha continues, but if the wealth a disciple of the Noble Ones gets for these 5 reasons increases, the one thinks, so the riches I've obtained for these reasons are increasing. And so he has no regrets in both cases. So again, in the case that despite spending one's wealth in all these good ways, you find that you're actually still getting wealthier. It's like, well, then there's nothing to worry about. Now you have even more that you can offer to others, even more good that you can do for the world. And then the sutta concludes with some short verses. So these are verses for someone who has practiced generosity to reflect on. So it says, I have enjoyed my wealth, supporting those who depend on me. I have overcome losses. I've given uplifting religious donations and made the 5 offerings. I have looked after the ethical and disciplined spiritual practitioners. I have achieved the purpose for which a wise lay person wishes to gain wealth. I do not regret what I've done. And it says, a mortal person who recollects this stands firm in the teaching of the Noble Ones. They are praised in this life by the wise, and they depart to rejoice in heaven. So that's the end of the sutta, so we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And at this time, we'll see if there's any questions. So hello to Mike, Monal, Sean, Maria, Craig, Sud, Amaranta, Amy, Teddy, Brian, Gregory, and Wasabi-chan. Good to see all of you. And I see a question here. So Sud says, would somebody like that person mentioned in the sutta be born into wealth again, even if their wealth runs out in this life? Very likely. Very likely. So in, for example, the Chulakama Vibhanga Sutta, the lesser discourse on the analysis of karma, one of the examples the Buddha gives is he says that a person who practices generosity is likely to be born wealthy, to be born into a wealthy family or born into wealthy conditions. So he says the path to wealth is generosity. He says this quite clearly. So yes, somebody who acquires wealth for wholesome purposes and uses it for wholesome purposes, as he's describing in the sutta, they are creating the conditions to continue to have access to wealth in future lives as well. Whereas the opposite, in the Chulakamavibhanga Sutta, the Buddha also says that one who is stingy, one who doesn't like to give to others, one who always withholds what they have for themselves, one who is not interested in sharing with others, that kind of person is born impoverished, and they find it very difficult to get wealth in future lives. So there is this immediate karmic connection that the Buddha spoke about. Generosity is the karmic condition for being wealthy in future lives, whereas stinginess and withholding is the karmic condition for being poor in future lives. And that's the only question. So if that's it for this evening, we can go ahead and conclude the session with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.